Trade up, trade back, trade for a player, trade for the future. There's all kinds of different scenarios that the Chiefs are going to be presented with here in a couple weeks, the NFL draft. Let's talk about the theories behind them now.
This is KC Sports Network, proudly presented by Emprise Bank.
Welcome into the KC Laboratory, presented by Emprise Bank, member FDIC, our absolutely wonderful partners in Possible here at KC Sports Network. If you have any banking needs whatsoever, feel free to reach out to them. That's who I bank with for the KCS and Draft Guide, which released last week, so you can take advantage of that with the link description in the show. Look at me just hitting an ad right off the top. I'm here with Craig Stout. Craig, hi, how are we?
I'm doing very well, Kent. You know what? We don't ask you this enough. Kent, how are you?
I'm doing good. I'm doing fantastic. Thank you for asking, Craig. It feels nice. Why do you think I ask all the time?
Listen, by the time it gets back around to me, we've lost the plot. Maddie's told a joke. I can't throw it back to you in the same sort of way. So taking advantage of the fact that Maddie's once again not here, obviously taking care of stuff at home. He's good. Everybody's good. But, I'm taking advantage of him not being the intermediary here. And I could throw it back to you and ask you how you're doing.
Well, like early in the week, I said, Matt, Craig. Yeah. Maddie is...
That's automatic, ladies and gentlemen.
I think it's just like, there's just a habit formed here. Maddie's doing great. Maddie and family is doing great. So congratulations to Matthew. We love you very much, and we are so happy for you. I mean, everything went well for all those that know. So very happy for Maddie and family. Congrats to him. Let's get into this, though. So, Craig, it is kind of funny. We're sitting here, we were prepping for today's show, and we both kind of had a few ideas that we wanted to throw out, and ultimately, it was kind of like, oh my gosh, we have so much in common.
It was the same idea. It really was the same idea that we both came up with, separate from each other. And yeah.
We've been doing this too long. But why don't you kind of just, we're going to let you kind of drive here a little bit, because like yours was definitely more fleshed out than mine was. I had more of a siloed thought, and you had a couple more big picture thoughts to it. But like, we'll let you kind of set the stage. We'll let you kind of lead some things here, and then we'll kind of get into some of this stuff. But basically, we want to talk a little bit about, the theories around and the thought processes around some of the things that the Chiefs could do with their draft capital here in a couple weeks.
Yeah. We talk all the time about Chiefs trading up, trading back, moving around in the draft a lot. And it's always around specific players. A couple weeks ago, we picked Brian Thomas Jr. to the Chiefs in a small trade up. It's always focused around singular players or trade up for a tier of offensive tackle, for example, trade up for something like that. And so because of that, we get so laser focused on these trade up scenarios being tied to just individuals and, these essentially just singular dart throws, when we've got this entire history of not necessarily the Chiefs, but the entire NFL, that we can see how often this works out, how often it doesn't work out. We have enough data, especially since the CBA in 2011, where we've now seen a couple of different iterations of players go through second and third contracts. Again, enough data to be able to make quantifiable decisions based off of that. So decided to look at kind of, we know they can stay put. We know that they can pick the value of that. But to look up, trading up, trading down, trading for a player, and trading, for a future pick, look at some of those scenarios in the context of not a player specifically, but the move as a whole, what we think are the positives there, what we think are the negatives, and just kind of flesh some of that out. There'll still be draft picks tied to some of these. It's going to be inevitable. We're draft guys. We're going to throw names around. It's part of this. But again, looking at this more holistically than tying it specifically to a player.
And one thing I think will be fun to navigate is when you talk about the history of some of these things, right? The context of the moment you're in now doesn't flesh itself out, even though the trends in the history are still there. And so that might be where some people could fall into a trap. Some people maybe are going against the grain of what is right and what is not at times, right? So that's what's going to be. I mean, like, I think it's fun. It's going to be fun to look at the history while also navigating the sentiments you're feeling in this individual draft, in this individual scenarios. Like, that's why I think this is going to be a fun exercise for us to do.
Yeah, I think so too. So let's start with trading up, where the marker's already on there for the video people. Again, we're going to do pros and cons. We're going to discuss some of the, numbers behind it and things like that. So this is obvious, I think, Kent, if we're going to talk about pros, but trading up in the draft, give me some of the advantages of trading up in the draft.
Do you want me to give you advantages specifically to the Chiefs, or do you want me to give you advantages just from a broad perspective?
Let's do it from both. If you, we got time, time.
I think apples to apples, it's tough to just completely say like, hey, here's the benefits of trading up beyond just you have strong conviction and belief in one specific player. You believe that player is a blue chip player, go get that blue chip. I think when I look at it specifically from the Chiefs, I think that's, oftentimes the Chiefs were very aggressive in trading up for Trent McDuffie. They went, like, if you want to look at some of the recent memory, outside of the Rashee Rice pick, they were aggressive or outside of the Felix Anudike Uzomah pick, there was no chance they were getting, they were trading up, trading back, whatever. They were aggressive for Rashee Rice. They were aggressive for Wanya Morris and made moves and surrendered assets to try to make sure that they were going to go get those guys that they specifically wanted. So I think, when you are looking at team needs, you're looking at pockets of players, you were looking at blue chips, that's where the advantages of, trading up can exist, not sitting on your hands and being aggressive and going and getting somebody that you have strong conviction on. I want to take this opportunity to maybe kind of tail away. We'll get back on the main path here shortly.
Yeah.
I think there's two things. The more I think about this, the more I think that I was, the NFL draft props are starting to pop up. And I love to use those as barometers for, the wide for scenarios that might be happening. And I'm looking specifically at the wide receivers. And currently the line is set at 6.5 receivers drafted in the first round. Over 6.5 is currently plus money, which would indicate that it's most likely not going to happen.
Right.
The closer we get to this draft, think that there is a scenario where if the Chiefs sit on their hands, then that 7 receivers are drafted. Because I look at some of the teams ahead of or right behind them, like Carolina, New England, that I could see very easily trading back into the first round to try to acquire a wide receiver. And if that's the case, then the Chiefs are going to potentially be stuck having to pick wide receiver 7 or entirely different position, which makes me think you've got some teams right behind you. I think this team might have to trade up. I think this team is going to have to try to trade up, and I don't think anything's off the table, especially considering this scenario here. With the context of this year, you have future assets that you could potentially surrender that you got from the L'Jarius Sneed trade. You don't have to. It doesn't have to be a like-for-like pick. You could use as much as your first round pick, knowing that you have 3 top 100 selections in 2025 still. And look, Brett Veach had some success trading up for Trent McDuffie recently, trading up for Rashee Rice recently. I think the Chiefs might feel to get ahead of that pocket and not be stuck with the last player in that pocket either. That they have to go up and they have to go be aggressive and try to trade up to get one of these guys.
Yeah, and I get that. Like, I do. Obviously, it worked. You listed all those examples. It also worked for the best player in the world. Chiefs offered a haul for Patrick Mahomes, and that obviously worked. So yes, the pros are you're playing in a different tier of player. I mean, kid, if I told you, all things considered, would you rather have pick 10 or pick 32? You're choosing not, rings are awesome. I'm not saying that there's a ring. Let's call it 31. Pick 10 or pick 31. You're taking pick 10, if you're not having to trade up for it. Your pool players is better. You have a better chance at hitting on a blue chip player. That's the logic behind it. I'm going to pivot to the cons a little bit here.
Go.
So, we talk about the con side of things a lot, involving this, that Brian Thomas Jr. trade that I mentioned that we did on the mock draft. There were people that didn't like that because we gave up pick 95, and they're looking at pick 95 as a quality player, a player that could mean something to this roster 2025 and beyond. I understand that line of thinking. I do. However, historically, teams that have traded up have gotten such undervalue. And, there's lots of performance metrics. I'm kind of looking at average value here. This Pro Football References average value. It's not a perfect metric by any means, but it's a wide group of players. So, if I was comparing like for like players, probably wouldn't use it. But as a wide swath of players, you feel pretty good about how their formula has shaken out, that most of the players that, are in the 18 to 20 range, they're good football players. You're not getting ancillary spikes in there. It is overwhelmingly favorable to stay put and draft a player at the position that you are than to trade up, even for a quarterback. You look at historical data, trading up into the top 5. Hell, we just had one last year, with Bryce Young, and we see that. We see quarterback as this kind of bastion of, hey, you just do whatever you could take, what you could do to get your guy. And so you got to trade up for guys like that. You got to take swings on guys like that. I bet they'd rather have that back. I bet Kyle Shanahan would rather have the Trey Lance trade back, the Sam Darnold trade, Mitchell Trubisky trade, Jared Goff trade. Those are the last 5 that have occurred that teams have spent significant capital to go up and try and get a guy. And it just has not worked out in the way that we think of it. Now, works to stay put and take a guy. And, we've seen that happen time and time again. The Chiefs are actually a little bit more on the positive side of this trade-up scenario, especially in recent memory, especially in the Brett Veach era. So I look at this a lot. The NFL shows even slight trade-ups, the value of asset, unless you're trading away a late pick, the value of asset that you're giving up, it's just not worth it to your team. The player difference is not significantly different. There are obvious differences that will happen in spikes like that. But on top of that, button all this up, you're also paying a higher percentage of the cap if you trade up in that scenario. And while that doesn't seem like a big deal for a quarterback, because it's not, if you're paying a veteran, you're paying way more than you're paying the number 1 overall draft pick. But let's look at a scenario, because this gets thrown around a lot. What if the Chiefs traded up for Brock Bowers? What if they made a significant trade up? You realize that the Chiefs traded up in the early teens, Brock Bowers has more guaranteed money than all but 12 NFL tight ends right now under contract? Like, when you start trading up and spending those assets on positions that even are premium positions, by and large, you are paying much more than for your production than it's actually worth to trade up anymore. And it's just kind of a wild thing to sit here and look at all these numbers now that we have this data. It's becoming more and more apparent that the Chiefs and Patrick Mahomes and Trent McDuffie and Rashee Rice and, all those examples Kent gave, they're actually on the outside looking in, from an NFL perspective. They've been better at it than the rest of the NFL. At some point, you would guess that that's going to stabilize.
Not in this era.
They're just going to continue to play. I'd say that Brett Veach just knows exactly what he's doing. That's fine.
I think the some of the cons tied to the pros for the trade out theory, which I could kind of get into a little bit. When it comes to trade out, you talk about cap space, right? You're talking about the the number being associated with that player. It's that one player. And the trade out theory is, okay, let's not push all the chips in for one player. We're paying one fixed amount of dollars. Let's move back. Let's accumulate more bites at the apple, because there is randomness to the NFL draft. You can make good educated guess. And I do think there are teams that are better at it to a degree than others. The margin's not astronomically big, but there are teams that are better at it than others. When you move the money, when you move back, now you're giving yourself more bites at the apple, more chances. You're also spreading the dollars that you are spending around to multiple players. You are not overexposed at any different spot in the draft. You're moving back, you're accumulating more assets, and you're giving yourself a better chance to hit on more players. It may not be the most obvious of players, and you might be getting a little lucky with some of the flyers that you might be getting in some of these trade back scenarios. But it's giving yourself an opportunity to grab more players that you believed in throughout the pre-draft process. And some teams tend to subscribe to volume more than aggression. And I think there's merit to a trade back. I used to be a lot more firmly trade back. I was probably, you and me were always very pro trade back, and Maddie was very pro trade back. And then Maddie was always very I'll trade up.
Not like analytical trade back, like if you're doing the PFF draft simulator and you just keep trading back and getting 8+s.
No,
continuing to trade back and accumulate all the 7th round picks. That's not what we're talking about.
No, it's just taking a small move back and living in a different pocket.
I mean, I've always been team trade down. I like accumulating assets, and looking through the numbers here, I've got from games played, season started, the average value of the player. We can even throw in awards. All pros and Pro Bowls. The team that trades down overwhelmingly wins every single one of those categories. That's right. Even the All-Pros and the Pro Bowls. You're thinking, we've got to make a trade up for a player because this guy's a perennial All-Pro. And too often now you see that team go up to do that. And guess what? It doesn't matter. The team that's trading down is actually finding more value, finding more players of quality there. Now, some of that could be positional value. It gets a little closer once you start factoring in positional value, but it's still overwhelmingly in favor of trading down. And as a matter of fact, I've seen a lot of stuff that are looking at cost versus performance, and where the surplus value lives historically over the last, since 2011 here. The sweet spot in the draft time and time again is pick 50. That's right where it is. That's where you're finding the most performance for the value of, the salary that you're playing them. And so I'm looking at this a little bit. Obviously, pick 32, you're actually getting quite a bit over value as well, surplus value there. But, the further up in the draft, the more money you're paying. So the Chiefs are living right now in that kind of world of the surplus value. So I could see a small trade back, knowing that you've got a strong class and a lot of different positions, try and find that surplus value standpoint. Chiefs have analytics guys that are kicking around that are looking at all this stuff as well. I just find it very interesting that right at that pick 50, that's kind of the sweet spot of then it starts kind of falling on either side.
And I think, one thing I would be kind of curious about with, when you're talking about context of all of this, are the teams trading back normally the more stable, well-run organizations? And is it not just a correlation between bites at the apple, but is it also a correlation between a lot of GMs that are desperate to make some win now splashes? I think there is something to be said there about, I want to go back to the trade up theory for a second. It's kind of this, I think there's a lot of teams that just go and make these all in moves because they don't have a choice, because they may not be there next year if things don't go well for them. And so they're willing to sacrifice assets. How many times do we see teams that it's a GM on his last year who's like, I got to go do this. And if I don't do this, then I'm not going to be here and I'm not going to have to worry about making next year's pick. But here's where I think the scenarios present themselves. I think Brett Veach is always blue chip hunting. And I think he is always looking for opportunities to acquire players he believes are blue chips. And I think he knows how difficult it is to acquire blue chips at pick 32. And so he is more willing to do things aggressively. This is why I look at the receivers this year. If he believes Thomas Jr. is a blue chip player, then why not go be aggressive and move up for him?
Sure.
Because in a normal draft, Brian Thomas Jr. maybe isn't available where the Chiefs could trade up.
Maybe he's a top 10 pick or something like that if he doesn't have 3 legitimately great receivers in front of him. Yes, I'm with you. Yeah.
Screw it. Here's what I'll say.
Yeah.
I'll go crazy here. If Rome Odunze somehow gets outside of the top 10 or close to it, I would go all in. I would trade next year's 1. I'd trade a 3 next year and your first. I would go nuts to try to go get Rome Odunze. I would go all in because that guy normally is a top 5 pick. He's a top 5 pick in next year's draft. But if for some reason, because of how the board falls, Rome Odunze is sitting there and a team or two, I don't know. There's a team there that isn't really overly excited about taking the wide receivers, wanting to move back and accumulate assets because they're not even close to in a win-now scenario and they want to try to just generate a bunch of picks. I'd go crazy and I wouldn't blink. I know that bucks the trends that we're talking about here, but these are the scenarios and the little. I think when you look at both scenarios, this is where it both works. Most of the time, I think the trade up, trade back teams are in places or in completely different scenarios of security / insecurity. There's the one little caveat for why I could see the Chiefs because they're a well-run organization. They're coming off 2 rings and all this stuff. So they don't have a ton of pressing needs. The roster is relatively healthy. Man, that's why you go do it if you're the Chiefs, even though it kind of bucks the trends of the teams that are typically trading up. Anyways, yeah.
But I mean, sorry. And to counter that, these 284 different trades that fulfill this criteria. So it's not just the smart teams are the ones that are consistently doing it. That's a lot of trades. At a certain point, you narrow the noise of some of that. But you touched on one of the points that I was going to actually make in one of these future things, but now's a great time to talk about it. Brett Veach has the best job security in the world right now. He can afford to do things like that. You alluded to it. Your line of thinking with go get this one guy, go spend those picks, go try and do that. You can be a little more risk secure in yourself. If you trade up for Rome Odunze, let's say something happens, who knows, Rome doesn't work out for whatever reason, that does not kill this team in the same way that it kills other football teams, that it kills the New Orleans Saints trading an ungodly amount of draft capital over the last several years despite consistently punting their salary cap. They know that they are secure in what they are doing largely year after year because they're just going to keep kicking that down the road. And guess what? If they end up failing, well, that's the next guy's problem. So it's one of those where you look at Brett Veach and this line of thinking and Kent's line of thinking is right in line with what his probably should be. Be aggressive. Go for the 3P. Try and do something that's never been done before. Try and make this team significantly better by catching a falling stud in the NFL draft. I completely get it. There are tons of examples of teams doing that. Tons of examples and outliers and things like that of teams doing it. But at the same time, even good football teams can make draft mistakes that set them back. Sure. And you do something like that, and now all of a sudden, Chris Jones, maybe that contract doesn't work out. You mortgaged your future draft picks. Mahomes' money is really hitting. There are all sorts of things that stack up to we need players that we can even roster on this football team. So we shouldn't be trying to mortgage the future and give away picks. It's a weird back and forth that you got to go through with some of that.
I think the trade in, it's the trade up, the trade out. Both scenarios are. I would be surprised if the Chiefs trade out. I would. Just I don't know. We've seen him do it once.
I know. It's bucking trends for the Chiefs. It's bucking trends for Brett Veach.
And to play the cons, you're normally taking yourself out of a pocket of players.
Yes.
Or you're taking the bottom. Now you're taking the bottom of the barrel of a pocket of players.
Yeah.
Whereas you might have had a little bit more choice there. And now, the Chiefs did it, and they took Sky Moore, who was maybe at the bottom tier of bottom of the tier that they were looking at, and this is how it turned out. I will say the Chiefs weren't planning on trading up for Trent McDuffie, and he was just there.
It's true.
So, that's what I'm saying.
Brett Veach has scenarios. Exactly. We're not saying that Brett Veach isn't sitting there going, "I'm definitely not trading up because the numbers are wrong," and all. No, he's got all sorts of ranges that he could trade up to, already agreed in principle.
And I think it's for specific players.
Correct.
I think it's for specific players. There's been players that they have been interested in trading up for in the past. Mm-hmm. That the specific scenarios that might present themselves. That scenario with a Roma Dunze is a specific scenario that I would be paying attention to. Just because that's not source. It's just
no.
If
a great wide receiver falls to the point where the Chiefs can reasonably get him, yeah.
If the Bears, feel like they have enough at wide receiver and they think they can get a really good receiver to pair with Keenan Allen and DJ Moore and want to move all the way, I know the word just go all the way back into the trade up theory. It just kind of flowed out because it all ties together. But maybe the Bears want to trade out and they want to accumulate a bunch more assets and keep the roster healthy. And, hey, look, Poles and Brett have a history, so maybe
it's true.
You go crazy and trade all the way up to 9. And we're gonna take a break.
Byron Murphy the second.
Oh no. We're gonna take a break. I need to recover. Be right back after this.
We appreciate you supporting KC Sports Network by listening to our podcast. You have helped us become the highest-ranked Chiefs podcast network in 2022 and 2023. And don't forget about our daily Substack newsletter, the best written analysis you can find on the Chiefs straight to your inbox every day. kcsn.substack.com.
All right, Craig, you wanted to talk a little bit about trading your draft capital for a player. And I do want to add before we get in here, and you can just kind of present it after this, but I do think it's funny. I think I mentioned this on this show. I know I've tweeted it out, but things like, for instance, the tag in trade. The Chiefs have been a part of 4 of the last 7 of those, so I think we've normalized it in Kansas City more than it actually exists. Yeah. But we've seen this team use 2 first-round picks in the Brett Veach era to go out and get veterans and then pay them handsomely, which is a con for this. But anyways, the floor is yours, Craig.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, let's start with the con on that one, because the first thing that everybody jumps to is you are trading one of my cost-controlled assets for the right to pay somebody an ungodly amount of money. Yes, that's absolutely valid, and you are 1,000% correct. That is not using that pick for its maximum monetary and roster-building capacity that you can really use it for. So yes, massive con from that standpoint. The massive pro, Brandon Ayuk level receivers are not going to be available at pick 32. Just using that as a reference. We've talked about him on the lab before, not condoning for or against it, just using his name right here. That guy is not going to be somebody that you're going to be able to just get at pick 32 in his current state. So to Ken's point that he was talking about trading up massively for a Roma Dunze, a cost-controlled asset, understand how that could happen. Trading a singular first-round draft pick rather than multiple first-round draft picks to move up for a player that's going to have the same impact over the next 2, possibly 3 years as Roma Dunze does. Yes, you're paying him more. Yes, you're limiting your roster construction, but you take some of the guesswork out of the draft there. This is an established NFL player. We evaluated him in college. We saw these deficiencies. He's improved on them so significantly that we feel confident that he is going to continue to be a good NFL player for our football team. That's the reasoning behind it. That's the reasoning behind trading a first-round draft pick for a Laramie Tunsil. They're not trading him. The Houston Texans are not selling anybody right now. But you look at a lot of these players and a lot of the quality, and you just don't get it for that kind of pick late in the draft here. Again, talking specifically for the Chiefs. Value is better for certain to hold on to that pick, but you just don't have the ability to continue building your roster very well if you are sitting here throwing big assets and big money at players.
Right. And I think context is required for that conversation too, because the Chiefs did those, but they really largely did the two big ones they did with Frank Clark trading a first-round pick and Orlando Brown trading a first-round pick, albeit a pick swap and some stuff moving around, and essentially it's the value of the 38th pick in the draft. Mm-hmm. They did it while Patrick Mahomes' cap hits were largely small. Largely small. How about that? While they were on the smaller side, while they were still, not necessarily having to pay the ridiculous size cap hits on the Patrick Mahomes contract.
Correct.
So they went all in to go make sure that they just put good football players in high positional value around Patrick Mahomes while they had the flexibility to be able to pay him. Yeah, I think it ties to some of the trade up scenario too. It's, hey, look, though, you are giving up multiple assets, multiple cost controlled assets to go in on one singular player in a sport that has some of the most volatility. It actually probably is the most volatile sport where injuries can happen. A la, hey, look, Frank Clark played through some injuries. He played through some medical stuff that, changed his body composition, changed his strength and his ability. That's the risk you deal with. Frank Clark's still a good player, still did some really good things, obviously, in the Super Bowl run. And he's a player that should be beloved by fans because of how hard he played through a lot of stuff that normally other players wouldn't. But that's the downside, and the risk that you incur is you are just there's no diversification of the portfolio, and in fact, it's the most restrictive of the portfolios that we are kind of outlining here.
Correct. Absolutely correct. And when you look at that, the Frank Clark trade, it was one of those that. At the moment, Montez Sweat was the name that was associated with that. And now you look back at it, a first and a third, maybe you have to give up the same compensation for Montez Sweat. Which one of those players would you have rather had during that time period? Obviously, he had roughly the same stats as Frank Clark as far as rushing the quarterback, getting after the passer. Does that translate? Do the intangibles that Frank Clark seemed to get them over there?
And was he ready now?
Yeah, was he ready now? That was
timeline matters.
Yeah, I mean,
which speaks to the contract situation too. That's the timeline of all this matters when you're looking at this is the window we're trying to win in right now. We're going to make sure that this roster is Super Bowl ready at all times, ready to rock, ready to fight. We're not going to rely on a rookie edge rusher and, hope he's good in year one. We're going to try to get the known commodity now. So that's why you do that.
It is why you do that. And it is why, I find it very interesting when you look back at the Chiefs' top 30 visits. Now they're still taking top 30 visits. They're far from done here at the point that we're recording this. But if you look back at the top 30 visits that they've had over the past several years, even during the COVID year, when they, had a lot more flexibility with who could come and win and all of that, the Chiefs have always had a handful of guys that they brought in for top 30 visits that were, top 10-ish players, guys that have floated in the top 20, largely first-round players for, the top of the heap there. They spread them out throughout the course of the class, but, they bring in a lot of guys that you look at and you're like, wow, I get it. That guy's an early rounder, but I didn't think that the Chiefs would have a shot at him. The Chiefs haven't brought in any of those guys this year. None of them.
That we know.
that we know. Again, these are reported.
There's always,
and again,
there's some gamesmanship here. You gotta pay attention to that a little bit.
But as it stands right now, we knew about the Chiefs visiting with Devontae Wyatt. In that year, we knew about the Chiefs interviewing some really early corners in some drafts that didn't seem like, that doesn't seem like a thing that they're planning on doing. We haven't seen any of those yet. And if you're a team that maybe isn't planning on having a first-round draft pick because you've committed it elsewhere, or a team that feels confident in moving way, 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 way up, or whatever the case may be, you wouldn't necessarily be auditioning a lot of those early picks. Brett Veach has leaned on this before. I'm not saying that he's going to lean on it again. My ears are just perked a little bit, despite the overwhelming cons of doing that when you need roster flexibility.
So explain to me what you think here. Like, do you think that he's...
I don't know. I don't know if it's a trade back scenario where they're not really looking at, guys that are falling, those typical early round guys that it's like, well, hell, if we allow that talent to fall far enough, we'll go up and get him. That comes from. But I just know that Brett Veach has spent a lot of time with early picks in the past several drafts, and he's not now. So there's got to be a reason why we haven't heard of any.
Yeah, I think there's a few scenarios. Keep them under wraps if you're going up for them, or you're just simply not doing it, or you think these are clean prospects and you don't need to find anything else about them through these top 30 or through these 30 visits. I think it's interesting. Like, a lot of there's always a few too that just that are always just interesting, right? Like Michael Hall out of Ohio State. Like, that's a fascinating one to me. Like, I like the idea of it. I'm just like, it's just interesting. Why are you going and looking at a 3-tech? Like, I'm intrigued. I like that they're doing it. I can very logically build the case for why you would do it. It's just, I don't know. Ears are perked a little bit.
Again, living in that sweet spot, like Rashee Rice. He was a guy that was in on a top 30 visit for the Chiefs, maybe for character stuff. Who knows? We'll see. But, it's one of those are the types of guys that they've looked at. And yes, Ken, we can transition to the other reason why they might not be looking at first rounders in this year's draft, trading for a future pick. I know that the Chiefs are consistently going to be at the very end of the NFL draft each and every year. So, teams are looking at that first as not a whole lot of value. However, there are a number of teams right now that we are hearing are extremely interested in the Bo Nixes and the Michael Penixes of the NFL draft. And so a scenario where one of those teams would rather address an offensive tackle position or, draft a stud wide receiver early, feels confident that when it comes back to pick 32, they've got the Kansas City Chiefs and they're willing to trade a future pick. Maybe not a one, because again, it would be a team that, I don't know. We'd have to see what the value is on that. Maybe it's a future two. Now all of a sudden the Chiefs get to come back, or not a future two. It's a future one with, a little bit of compensation in that year's draft. But now you're coming back to a situation where Brett Veach doesn't want to talk to a whole bunch of top 30 guys that are going to be around. The Chiefs, as we talked about earlier this week, need guys on the roster. They need talent next year. They need bodies out there. Mm-hmm. We also said that we felt semi-confident in their ability to, go into the year with this roster. If all of those things are true, maybe Brett Veach is looking ahead to say, I can catch some real blue chip value because I covet that so much in next year's draft if we just make a slight trade back so that we can recoup something and more assets next year. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think you got to look at the timeline of the team, and you talk about it. The 2022 draft class will be playing on a contract year in 2025, so there would be a overlap of players, but there also would be a restocking of the shelves for some players that you got there and coming on under contract in 2025 or ending their contract in 2025. I like the idea of delayed gratification of, maybe it's a team desperate, with a GM that's, running the risk of losing his job and going and taking advantage of, maybe getting a future first and an asset in 2024 that you can still draft players. You can still move up from 64 and go grab a receiver you like in the 50s somewhere, like the Chiefs did for Rashee Rice. Like, you're still getting good football players. You're still maybe getting the bottom of that barrel in the 20 to 50 range, but you're still getting a good football player that you liked a lot and giving yourself some delayed gratification and, for me, a moniker to, come up with to root against one of those teams in the 2024 NFL season. Yeah. I think, it doesn't happen all that very often that teams punt on like a future first, but it does happen from time to time. And it's an interesting tactic to try to employ, but tough sell, I think. I think it'd be a tough sell. I think it would be a tough sell for this fan base if the Chiefs punt on a future first.
Especially if they're going to run it back like with largely the same group from last year, Yes, the Super Bowl, but now all of a sudden you start to look at Brett Veach a little differently for something like that. But again, it talks to the comfort level of a G, and Brett Veach could, get nothing out of this first round draft pick this year. And guess what? He's probably still safe. He could do it back. He's probably still safe. So
yeah. I think as long as Mahomes is here, it's going to be hard for him to be unseated too, because I think there's really good relationship in there too. I'll also say, like, if you want to talk about the pros of trading for the future, the wave that we are seeing that has been a huge factor in the Chiefs winning back-to-back Super Bowls is when they had a ridiculous amount of assets and built a defense in 1 year and got a blue chip player because they were willing to sit out a year in a draft. So if you feel like you can get a receiver at pick 50 that you really like, that's not going to be too much different than the guy you get at pick 32, for instance, then hey, maybe you can punt on 2024's first rounder, get I don't know, Cleveland's first round pick, and root for them to be terrible.
I would love it if Cleveland traded up to replace a quarterback. No, I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying. And that's what it is. You talk about the blue chip guys. He's done a really good job of identifying them and taking care of them and keeping them in Kansas City so far. So continue to give yourself more bites at the apple. We talk about wide receivers all the time. Is next year's class going to be as good as this year's class? No, probably not, but it's still going to be good. Like, it's still going to be a ridiculously good class. And we talk about how often the draft kind of falls off at around pick 18, 19, 20. The Chiefs have pick 18 in next year's draft. You feel really confident about what you can get. You feel really confident about their ability to go and identify a guy. And you've still got the L'Jarius Sneed third round pick as well in next year's draft. A lot of assets for a team that is going to need another infusion of talent just because they've done so well identifying players late in drafts. They can't afford to pay them. It's not part of the long-term plan, unfortunately. So you need another infusion of talent. I could see in a scenario where they just, rather than force a selection at 32, call around and see if you can make yourself significantly better in 2025 and 26, 27, 28, and beyond.
Hey, Craig. Do you remember when the Chiefs traded their first-round pick in 2024 and still won the Super Bowl despite not having a first-round pick in 2024?
How great would that be? Like, seriously, how great would that be?
They three-peat and I don't know, the Saints went 4-13, and they're sitting there at pick 5, and they're drafting Travis Hunter.
Oh, if if they draft Travis Hunter, do we get to see Andy and Spags fist fight over who gets to play him?
Yes. It's probably corner, but I don't know, man. Yeah, it'd be fun. It'd be like, it's just like, that's the kind of thing it would be.
Burton at pick 10, or, like there are
Luther Burton at pick 5.
Yeah.
Like, that's your blue chip. There you go.
Exactly. So rather than trying to do that, and again, at pick 50, I just got done talking about how that's the sweet spot in value in the draft. That's the sweet spot. That's kind of the confluence of production, cost, asset, cost, and all of that. It's about perfect. So you can make yourself live in both of those realms still, and still get good quality players in this draft and make yourself potentially significantly better in next.
It's an interesting scenario. And then, again, that's got to be a very specific. That's one of the more rare scenarios too, because it's a very specific scenario, and it takes a very specific type of team willing to do something like that, and you don't see it happen all that much. But it is something worth examining, and we did it. And I don't know. All right, of all these scenarios, Craig, what's most likely to happen Thursday, Friday, Saturday? Specifically Thursday. Let's do Thursday.
Specifically Thursday?
Yeah.
Most likely of these four.
For the Chiefs.
It's trade up, most likely. Trade up, then trade for player. So, not picking at 32, not picking. I have to choose between these four. Number one is they're staying put. But of these four, it's trade up, trade for player, trade out, trade for the future.
I don't think they're going to trade for a player, because I don't think they want to pay a player right now.
I don't think they want to pay a player either.
So I think it's trade up, trade out, trade for future, trade for player. Unless like day three picks, trade for player.
Oh, sure. Yeah. You said Thursday specific.
Like Thursday specifically, trade up, trade out, trade for future, or in that order for me, and then trade for player. Just because I don't think they want to pay a player, and they're not going to pay a first round pick for Brandon Ayuk, then not pay him.
I completely agree with that sentiment. But they did it for Orlando Brown Jr.
Yes, they did. But they kept it. But they kept him for two. They had him for 2 years.
Yeah, they kept him. They had cost control, and we talk ourselves into cost control.
Probably.
Probably.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Casey Laboratory. Thank you all so much for listening. We love you. We appreciate you. We'll catch you later.